All right, we are on the record. Last year was struck for cause by the court on the motion of the defense. Mr. Nelson, you wish to make your record, and then I'll turn to the state. Wherever. In fact, if you'd remain seated so you can pick up the microphone.
Yes, Your Honor, the defense made a motion for cause. There were several concerns about this juror made several equivocal statements about her ability to be impartial in terms of how the video or her previous viewing of the video had impacted her emotionally. I recognize that this juror said that she could set aside her opinions. However, whenever pressed, even by the state, she had a very difficult time acknowledging that she could apply the presumption of innocence because of her viewing of the video, and that it would be essentially that she had already made up her mind in this case. So that was essentially the basis, Your Honor, for the cause.
Okay. Mr. Slisher.
Thank you, Your Honor. The state opposed the motion to dismiss for cause for this juror. I don't believe she equivocated at all. I think that she stated very affirmatively and unequivocally that she could set aside her opinions, that she could set aside her beliefs, that she could apply the presumption of innocence. She stated it on a number of occasions, and she was questioned about it on a number of occasions, despite unequivocally stating so. What she said in terms of applying the presumption of innocence is that it would be difficult, but that she could do it, and that she wouldn't like the verdict, but that she could render it. And when you have somebody who states as thoughtfully as she seems to have considered her answers under oath, that she would follow the instructions and decide the case based only on the facts that are presented and on the judge's instructions, then I think that that is not a proper removal for cause. If the counsel would have wanted to use a preemptory challenge, he has plenty. He has 15 preempts that he could use. Those are extra preempts that have been given to him to account for some of the sensitivities in this case.
Well, let's be fair. Both sides have been given.
That's true.
Triple the normal.
That's true. We're entitled to 3. They're entitled to 5. You gave us 9. You gave him 15. So I'm not saying that's unfair. What I am saying, though, is that that was not a proper cause strike. I believe that she very clearly stated her opinion, and she was questioned over and over, and I think that perhaps a little bit more than other jurors. And I would just state that I don't think that it should have been granted, and we object to it.
The court did excuse the juror for cause. To be honest, I was evaluating as we were going along, and I don't think it developed immediately, but she was very consistent in saying that she would put everything aside, but she couldn't unsee the video, which is, I think, just another way of saying I couldn't put that aside, what I had seen earlier. Granted, it's probably going to be in evidence, but it's that concern that she has about not being able to unsee the video. She had a very strong emotional reaction to it. She said she cried. She has a very negative opinion of Mr. Chauvin, all of which does not constitute cause. But the bottom line being, it seemed to me that she was walking into the courtroom, especially when she said, I could render that verdict, but I wouldn't like it, is that she was not in the middle, neutral, but actually, which is why the court asked the presumption of innocence question. And when I finally gave her the space to say, how do you feel? Do you think sitting here right now, and it has to be right now, not later, can you presume the defendant innocent? She answered unequivocally no. That's the primary reason why I granted the cause challenge. I think there was sufficient, I agree with you, there's sufficient other things if the defense had wished to use their peremptory strike. She also had issues with child care as a single mom without a lot of strong support, but that was not the basis for the court's challenge because she did say she could be able to work through those. So, with that, we'll go to the next juror. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is juror number 38. Mr. Schaefer, is this the last one for this one? All right. Come on up. Good morning. You are juror number 38, is that correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Well, a couple of things before I turn you over to the attorneys to ask questions. First is, I'm going to swear you in so that all your answers to the questions are under oath. So raise your right hand, please. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that you will truthfully answer all questions about your qualifications to serve as a juror?
I do.
All right, thank you.
All right.
I was just going to say, we have COVID restrictions here, which include masking, but we have plexiglass between us, and I will be keeping my mask on, but I think that allows you to undo your mask if you'd like.
Thank you.
So feel free to do that during the questioning. The attorneys similarly, because they're behind plexiglass and quite a distance from you, will also be allowed to remove their masks. First of all, you filled out a questionnaire, and thank you for doing so. You put a lot of detail in, so it's clear you spent time on this. Is there any, or first of all, was everything true on that questionnaire?
Yes.
Is there anything you'd like to change or amend because you filled it out back in December, and on reflection you might think, well, I should have added this or deleted that, or even that my opinions have evolved on certain issues? Anything that you can think of as you sit here right now that you would want to change?
None that I can think of right now.
Okay. The attorneys will lead you through very specific questions, and so if that, and they'll usually give you what your answer was, because most people have not kept a copy of their questionnaire. Feel free to change your answer. Okay? And if you have any questions about what your answer was, I'm sure they will give it to you. So, you were not supposed to read any articles or watch any media related to the case. That was part of the questionnaire. Since you are a potential juror, don't look at anything about this case. But we recognize that was back in December. Inadvertently through the months, you may have been exposed to something just by seeing a headline, talking to a friend, something like that. Have you learned anything else about this case, whether it's facts, parties, procedures, pretrial matters, between when you filled out the questionnaire and now?
No, I have not.
Okay, thank you. Did you recognize anybody on the witness list?
I did not recognize anybody.
Okay. Now, going back to the questionnaire, you understand the reason why we ask all those questions is we want to know what your level of knowledge is and also the opinions. When you come into this courtroom, if you are on the jury, you have to decide this case just on the evidence you hear in court and follow the law that I give to you. Do you understand that?
Yes.
So in other words, you got to put aside anything you've seen or heard elsewhere, and even you've got to put aside any opinions you may have held about certain things, maybe opinions evaluating the case or what you've seen. Do you think you could do that?
Yes.
All right. And as I'm sure one of us will say, it's all right to have those opinions. We're not questioning the validity of any of those opinions. It's just we need to know if you can put them aside so that both sides have a fair and impartial trial.
Understandable.
Any questions about that?
No questions.
Think you can do it?
Yes.
All right. We also talked about the length of trial is about a month starting on March 29th. Do you think you can accommodate that schedule?
Yes.
All right. Anything else? Any questions for me?
No.
All right. I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Nelson, juror number 38. You may inquire.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning, sir.
Here's what I'd like to do, with your permission. I'm going to ask you a series of general questions, kind of get to know you a little bit, and then I want to follow back and circle back on some questions that you answered in your questionnaire. All right? Not trying to trick you, promise. Just trying to determine if you're the right juror for this case. Understood?
Understood.
All right, great. So if you and I were to meet in some social situation, a party or wherever that may be, what are a couple of things you would want me to learn about you in that conversation?
That I'm a stand-up guy, and that the type of person that would do anything for my friends or family.
Okay. So loyal to your friends and family?
Yes.
Okay. You got a jury duty notice, like you got I think an initial sheet saying you have jury duty, right?
Correct.
When you got that first sheet that says you have jury duty, what was your initial reaction?
I think the initial words that came out of my mouth is, how'd they find us again? Because I just recently moved to Minnesota.
Okay.
So that was my initial reaction.
Okay. So how long have you lived in Minnesota?
Just over 3 years.
Okay. And you, I think if I recall from your questionnaire, you actually had previously served on the jury?
I did.
Okay, we'll talk about that more later. But sort of like, I just moved here, how'd they catch me?
Yeah,
Right.
It was more of a sarcastic statement, but
Sure, understood. How about when you learned about this, you got a packet of information that you filled out, when you learned that you were a potential juror on this potential case?
I think my initial reaction was just, okay, this is big,
Okay,
but it's one of those things. It's a random draw. And I think that was my initial reaction.
okay. Did you have concerns for your personal safety at that time?
Not at that time. When I did fill out the questionnaire, as you know, I did have concerns just for the safety of not necessarily myself, but my family.
Okay. And when you came down to the government center, I believe yesterday you were here as well, right?
Correct.
When you came down to the government center and you saw its current condition, what did you think about all of that?
Frankly, I just looked like there's more construction on a building.
Okay. It didn't make you feel safer or alleviate those?
No, not at all.
You just thought it was construction courtesy of the National Guard, right?
Well, I mean, when you open up where we come in, yeah, the heart rate elevated a little bit, but not to an extent where I was nervous or scared or anything like that.
Okay,
But I think that's a normal reaction for anybody.
sure. When you got the initial instructions yesterday in terms of your anonymity and remaining anonymous, did that address any of your safety concerns?
That addressed it,
Okay.
perfectly addressed it.
Okay. So you know that at some point it's possible that your name, I don't know when, but your name, if you were to serve on this jury, could be released.
Yes.
Okay. Does that cause you any concern?
No.
Now, ultimately, sir, again, our job is to find whether you're the right guy for this job, right? It's kind of like a job interview in a weird way. So I'm going to ask you a series of kind of general questions again. Can you think of in your personal or professional life or in any of your activities where you've had to you've been called upon to resolve a dispute between two people?
Not necessarily in my personal life, just because over the past year, we've all been kind of isolated
Sure.
with the circumstances.
Right.
If I'm looking back from my professional standpoint, there was a time where I had to resolve an issue between one of our reps/employees and a customer. And I know most of us in society, there's a saying, the customer is always right. I don't necessarily believe in that 100%, but I do believe it. And there was a dispute between a customer and a rep, and had to listen to both sides, because ultimately I wanted to jump right to, well, the customer's right. But I listened to both sides because they're both adamant. And then at the end of it, it came down where the customer was right, but with certain circumstances that I understand why our employee handled it the way he or she did.
Gotcha.
So
You kind of answered what was going to be my next question, but if I can unpack that a little bit. So in resolving disputes, one thing that's important is to listen to both sides. Would you agree with that?
Oh, of course, 100%.
Okay. And were there other measures that you could take in that situation to try to verify who was right?
Well, I talked to both parties, of course.
Right.
I tried to understand it, and initially I went in just assuming that the customer was 100% right. So, you look at the employee and you just look at that in a different way. And I think after just talking to both sides, it was like, yes, I believe the customer was right, but with exceptions.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. So just generally thinking then, outside of the context of that particular circumstance, are there other tools or methods that you can employ to try to resolve a dispute between two people?
Well, I think keeping an open mind. I mean, obviously, that's common sense. I think listening to both sides and just trying to evaluate with the best information that you have at hand.
Right.
Without any, listening to other people around or other factors involved, just what I have in front of me. And that's what I try to do when I resolve disputes. So
if you're selected as a juror in this case, one of the things that you would be potentially having to do is try to resolve disputes between jurors, right? Or between how do we look at this piece of evidence. So take a hypothetical situation. Some piece of evidence comes in at this trial, and you think that this is the most important piece of evidence. But another one of the jurors looks at that same evidence, sees it completely different than you do, and thinks it's irrelevant, right? Or it's not a part of the equation. So the first question I guess I have is, how do you try to resolve that question over that piece of evidence?
That's a good question. I don't know if it's my responsibility to try to persuade the other juror or person, or just take that information, what's in front of me, and base my decision based on that. So if I think it's the most important, somebody else thinks it's irrelevant or doesn't see that, I don't know if it's my job to persuade them or their job to persuade me, but for me to evaluate it based on what I see.
Okay. Is it possible meaning you have a job to evaluate it for yourself on one hand, and you are going to have discussions about how important pieces of evidence are?
Oh, of course.
Right.
I mean, I know if I sit on this jury and we go into deliberation, we are going to have those conversations.
Right. And some of those conversations may be disputes, right?
Correct.
And ultimately, you know that any verdict that would be rendered needs to be unanimous.
Correct.
Right. So that means all 12 jurors have to agree. So the question becomes are you the type of person, let's take that example, right? You got this single piece of evidence. You're the only one now who thinks that this is the key. Are you the type of person who stands by his conviction, or do you simply agree with others for the sake of consensus?
I would say that I'm more of a person that stands by my own conviction, because that's who I am, and that's, in my opinion, that's all you have as a person, regardless of where we are here today. But that's what everybody should have, their own conviction, their own beliefs.
Right. And so ultimately, you understand that I don't think that there's going to be one single piece of evidence, right? Your job as a juror is to listen to all of the evidence. Can you do that?
Of course, yes.
You've already said you in the resolution of dispute, at least you understand it's important to hear from both sides. Can you hear from both sides?
Yes.
So the defense has no obligation whatsoever to present any evidence. We don't have to ask a single question. We don't have to do anything. We could sit here, right? And the burden still remains with the state to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. Are you okay with that?
Yes.
So if Mr. Chauvin didn't ask a single, or through me did not ask a single question, didn't submit a single piece of evidence, would that affect your, in other words, you're not hearing from the other side, right?
Right.
How would that impact your decision-making process?
It wouldn't affect me because of what you just said. If you're not obligated to do that, you don't need to, so I don't think that should affect
Okay.
me at all.
Now, can you think of a circumstance in your life where you've been 100% convinced you're right, only to later learn you were in fact wrong? Dude.
Is this something more sensitive?
Maybe.
I am going to find under Minnesota Rule of Criminal Procedure 26.02 subdivision 4, parent 4, matters to be discussed are deeply personal for the juror, and we will go off audio. What that means is we're shutting off the audio being broadcast outside this room. Everybody in the room can still hear it.
Okay.
But and it will be reported and made a matter of record, but is not being broadcast today.
Okay.
Okay? Did you?
Driver's seat in that regard.
All right, and we are back on audio.
We're going to do everything we can to obviously maintain that anonymity, right?
Thank you.
And so, all right, I think I've asked all my general questions. So let me ask you a few questions. Again, not trying to trick you. I know you haven't read this in quite some time. Obviously, we all have. All right. So the first question you were asked about was just to kind of give a little bit of a description about what you knew about this case already, right? So it's fair to say, sir, that you were very or at least familiar with this case before filling out this.
That's fair to say.
And you became aware of this case at the time it happened.
Yes.
And what you wrote is that, in part, was that a knee was placed over his, meaning Mr. Floyd's neck, which limited his breathing, and he shortly passed away after that. Right? So in terms of the phrase, limited his breathing, was that information that you got from the media? Was that based on what you perceived in any of the videos, or how did you come to that conclusion?
I came to that conclusion because of the small clip that I saw where he was saying, "I can't breathe." So that's where I drew that conclusion.
Okay.
From that specific clip.
Okay. And so you you have seen, I believe, and you indicated that you have seen some clips on the news and things of that nature, right?
I have.
So I'm trying to do this for everybody, which is when we talk about the video, what we're talking about is a bystander to this incident took a cell phone video, uploaded it to Facebook. That video went viral, and then that video led to massive press interest, right? So that's the video I'm talking about. Have you seen any other videos associated? Does that sound like the clips that you were describing?
I have not seen the Facebook video. I have not seen the video on social media whatsoever. It was more the national news,
right?
In that 5-10 second clip, but I have not watched the full video in its entirety at all. Anything on social media I haven't watched.
Okay.
even before I filled out the questionnaire.
Right. And so that was kind of a follow-up question, but I'm assuming you're a consumer of the news to some degree, whether it be on your phone or on the television or maybe not in the print form anymore. But you're a consumer of the news, and have you seen that clip or some variety of clips multiple times, or how many times would you have?
I mean, at some point when you watch the news, it's kind of hard not to see it.
Right.
But I would say 1 to 2, 3 times tops. It's not one of those things that we sit at home and watch news all night long. I mean,
Right.
we have a pretty active life where we're not, watching the news.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Now, you were asked your opinions as to my client and Mr. Floyd, and I believe that your response to both was the same. You checked that you were neutral as to both, and you wrote, "I don't have all the details of what actually happened." Why did you write that, and why is that important to you?
I put it neutral because I've never met, you want me to talk to both as individually or separately?
Both.
I've never met Mr. Floyd. I don't know his background, so I don't know who he is. I've also never met the officer, so I don't know his background, what's in his head and what's in Mr. Floyd's head. So I just put neutral because I base my, when I meet somebody, that's where I'm able to form a judgment or, have an opinion, but I haven't met either of them. So I think I wanted to try to be true to myself and saying, how do I have an opinion when I've never met them?
Okay. And did you form an opinion, any opinions whatsoever about the case based on the media presentation or what you may have seen in the news?
No, I mean, I'm one of those persons that I don't want to say skeptical of what I see on TV, but I also don't necessarily believe 100% of what's on the news or TV. I just kind of stay away from that.
Okay. There was a question in the questionnaire that reads, have you ever talked about George Floyd's death with your family, friends, or coworkers, or discussed it online, for example, on social media? It appears that you checked the box no, but then scribbled over that and then checked yes, and you wrote, we discussed mostly about the riots that took place after, but didn't about his death. Conversations were with immediate family. Would that still be accurate? I mean,
yeah, and I think I crossed it off when it's like talking on social media. I
Okay.
didn't talk about it on social media, so when I read that, and yeah, we, in passing, we have brief conversations. We're not a very political family that talk about politics when we get together. I mean, we're just more like, let's get out, have some fun, have some beers, have a good time. We did, just with living in Minneapolis, not living in the surrounding area of Minneapolis, but living in Minnesota, we talked about the aftermath and what happened, and it was kind of hard not to talk about.
right. Yeah, and that's fair. Again, everybody is entitled to their opinion, right? And that's not our job here, is to question the validity of your opinion. Our job is to determine, if you have formed an opinion, can you take that opinion and set it aside and fairly and impartially judge this case based on the evidence that you see in court? Can you do that?
Yes.
You were asked a question about whether you believe the community has been negatively or positively affected by any of the protests that have taken place in the Twin Cities area since George Floyd's death, and you wrote yes, negatively. Can you explain that?
Yes, I personally don't live in Minneapolis, but if I was speaking directly to the community within Minneapolis, I think it would be hard to say that what's happened over the summer positively influenced or was good for Minneapolis. With everything that was going on for whatever reason, I don't think that's positive. So I did definitely think that affected it negatively. I also look at it from a business owner's standpoint, where it may have affected a lot of different business owners. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously, if everybody saw what was happening, I don't think that was necessarily a positive thing, in my opinion.
So if you don't mind, let me just kind of explore this with you a little bit. Is there anything positive that came out of it, in your opinion?
I don't believe so.
Okay. So I think that, if I go back here, the question is about the protests, right? Would you agree that there is a difference, or maybe would you agree or disagree? There's a difference between protests and rioting.
100% difference between
Okay.
protesting and rioting.
Right. And obviously, would you agree, well, let me ask you, would you agree that there were both protests and riots that occurred after Mr. Floyd's death?
I would agree with that statement.
All right. The question was asking you about the protests, and I know that people kind of jumped to the riots. So in terms of the protests, is there anything positive that came out of?
I believe that if everybody has a right to protest for what they believe in, and so if we're looking at just that context of that part of it, yes, I mean, if the protests were, if it was positive for certain people that have certain beliefs,
Okay.
I believe that was positive. I do, on the other hand, think it may have gotten hijacked from the rioting, where it went from a peaceful protest to not so peaceful, and I'm all for anybody protesting what they believe in. I mean, that's our right as Americans.
Okay. Well, again, without referencing what your specific business is, but it's fair to say you're a business owner, right?
That's correct.
And I would assume that your business was affected by some of the COVID-19 restrictions and shutdowns.
That is correct.
Okay. And were you familiar with any of the protests associated with the governor's orders as they pertain to businesses and restaurants?
Somewhat. I don't know if it was televised as much or if it was talked about as much.
Did you participate in any of those protests?
No, not at all.
Okay. There was a page on here that had a series of statements labeled A through L. And they're just sort of these blanket statements, and then you were asked to kind of rank from 1 to 5 the level of your agreement or disagreement with that statement. Again, I don't expect you to remember all of them or what your answers were, but there's a couple of them I need to ask you about.
Okay.
The statement is made, discrimination is not as bad as the media makes it out to be, and you somewhat agreed with that statement. Can you explain your thinking in that answer?
Can you repeat that?
Sure. Discrimination is not as bad as the media makes it out to be.
I don't believe it is. I think the media tends to hype things tremendously on some aspects. In my personal life, I have friends of all backgrounds, and I don't see it. And I'm just going based on what's in my life. And I do believe the media does tend to hype things, whether it's about discrimination or any aspect of things.
Or even potentially COVID-19 restrictions?
COVID-19, I mean, a lot of different things. I think, and I'm not saying they do that for everything. I'm not a conspiracy theorist by any means whatsoever. I do believe sometimes in some aspects of the media, it is overhyped when it doesn't need to be.
Okay. So would that, the next question was, blacks and other minorities do not receive equal treatment as whites in the criminal justice system, and you somewhat disagreed with that. Is it the same rationale, or, I mean, it doesn't involve the media, but why would you somewhat disagree with that proposition?
I've never really been involved with the police. I don't personally see it. I don't think that's necessarily a 100% honest statement.
Okay, fair enough. Now, the one question I had was, this one statement reads, I support defunding the Minneapolis Police Department, and you strongly agreed with that.
I should have been strongly disagreed.
Okay. So that was an error on your
That
part?
was an error. I strongly disagree.
Okay. One question reads, because law enforcement officers have such dangerous jobs, it is not right to second-guess decisions they make while on duty, and you somewhat disagreed with that. Can you explain that?
Can you repeat that again?
I sure can. Because law enforcement officers have such dangerous jobs, it is not right to second-guess decisions they make while on duty.
I put somewhat disagree with that because I feel just because they're police officers, they should be held to a high standard, especially with their training that they've had. I think just because you have a badge doesn't give you, free pass on anything. And if there are certain instances where they should be questioned or should be looked into, I think that's a fair and reasonable statement.
Okay.
I don't think it should be, whatever decision it is, they're 100% accurate.
Okay. Now, you were asked a couple of questions about both the Black Lives Matter movement and the Blue Lives Matter movement. With respect to Black Lives Matter, the question reads, how favorable or unfavorable are you about Black Lives Matter? And you checked the box that says somewhat unfavorable, and you wrote, I feel the movement has good intentions, but has been involved in too much destruction in our city. Can you just explain that a little bit more?
I wrote that because, and again, I never read their mission statement. I mean, I understand their movement. I feel like it may have been hijacked again. I'm sorry to use that word again, but and maybe they intended to be peaceful in the beginning, but I feel like it's kind of moved away from that. Maybe not the entire movement or entire organization, but I also feel like, yes, Black Lives Matter, White Lives Matter, all lives matter, Hispanic lives matter. I feel like all lives matter.
Okay. I just have to ask, I mean, do you attribute all of the property destruction to Black Lives Matter movement or organization?
No, I have no factual basis on saying that or stating that, but you can't go through the city with seeing the initials. I mean, I think that's a fair statement, but do I attribute that movement with the destruction? No.
Okay. All right. With respect to Blue Lives Matter, you wrote somewhat favorable or neutral. You checked both boxes, and you wrote, I feel it is a tough job and we should have a level of respect for what law enforcement does every day. So can you explain that a little bit more?
Well, I put somewhat favorable only because if Blue Lives Matter is talking about the police officer, I do respect the men and women that put on the uniform, put on the badge, kiss their kids, kiss their spouse goodbye every single day, and put themselves in harm's way. Maybe not every day, but that's the job they signed up for. And I obviously put neutral because I don't know what the actual movement stands for. If it's a movement, if it's an organization, I haven't read the mission statement. I'm not really sure what the movement is.
Okay.
But that's where I put that down and then wrote that behind it.
Okay. Now, you did serve on a jury you used to live in California, correct?
That's correct.
And you served on a jury there.
That's correct.
So I'm not asking you to tell us what the verdict was, okay? So let's get that out of the way. Did you have a favorable experience in that?
Yeah.
Serving on that jury?
I mean, I wouldn't say favorable or unfavorable. I was willing to do it. But yeah, it was just fine.
Okay. Did you ultimately deliberate with the jury?
We did.
Okay. And did you ultimately reach a verdict, not knowing what the verdict was? I don't want to.
We did.
Okay. Now, so you have some experience in serving on a jury.
That is correct.
Right? And so you're familiar with the process of deliberations?
I am.
Is there anything about that that previous jury service that you think would somehow affect your ability to serve on this jury?
Not at all.
Right. You're not going to take what you learned in that situation in a different state and try to apply it here, right?
No, because you're comparing apples to oranges, especially in this case.
So let me ask you, I forgot to ask you a couple follow-up questions. In this case, you will hear testimony, I expect, from numerous law enforcement officers. I expect that you will hear testimony from numerous civilian witnesses and other people who investigations uncovered. Okay? Would you hold police officers' testimony? Would you determine it to be more truthful simply by virtue of the fact that they wear a badge?
No.
Are you? Would you, if you have a police officer who sees something and a citizen who sees that same thing, are you willing to treat those testimonies as equal?
I would.
Would you give any more credibility to the police officer simply by virtue of the fact he's a police officer?
No. I think for me it would be, you know, how it's said, and you know, if they're speaking with conviction, if they're speaking with more confidence, you know, you'd have to base that judgment, you know, once we're sitting here, if I'm sitting here.
Okay. All right. And one other question, general, I guess, question I forgot to ask you was, if you believe, if the judge instructs you on the law, and you believe the law should be different, or you think that what the judge told you is wrong, are you able to follow the law as the judge gives it, even if you think it should be different, or you think he's wrong?
Yes, I'd be able to follow the law.
All right. The last question was, do you want to serve as a juror on this case? And you checked the box, not sure. And you wrote about your concerns about, you know, the lack of anonymity or the fact that your name could become public. Do you still have those concerns?
I don't have those concerns anymore.
Okay. And so are you willing to serve on this jury?
Yes.
Is there anything that you think I should know that would affect your impartiality or anything of that nature?
No.
If I may have a moment here. We'll pass for cause.
Mr. Sisher.
Thank you, Your Honor. Juror number 38. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's not afternoon. So to clarify one of the questions that you answered on the questionnaire regarding police in your community, the question was, police in my community make me feel safe, and you said strongly disagree. At least that's what my notes. Might that have been an error?
It might have been an error. I might have been reading it wrong.
Okay. And so what would your answer be in terms of how police in your community make you feel? Do they make you feel safe?
They make me feel safe, yes.
Would you strongly agree with that answer?
I think that's a fair statement.
Okay. And you do strongly disagree with the defunding the Minneapolis Police Department, is that right?
That is correct.
Can you tell me why?
I feel like that would, let me back up. I feel like, police are hired to make the streets safe, make people safe, make people feel comfortable, and I think defunding that would kind of set a bad example, not necessarily for police, but for people that are in need. And if somebody is called upon and call the police, and if there's, because of limited funding, there's limited police officers, and the time to get to the call takes longer than it should, I feel like some people would be negatively affected by that, and I just wouldn't think that would be fair, and I don't think that I'd want that for any family or any business or anybody.
And so if you needed the police, you would like to know that you could pick up the phone, call, and that they would be available to help.
Yes.
And you would rely on them to do that.
Yes, depending on the situation, but yes.
Generally speaking.
Yes.
Right. Okay. It sounds like you have a strong respect for law enforcement. Is that fair?
I think that's a fair statement.
Have you ever had any negative interactions with law enforcement?
I have not.
Or any friends or close friends or family members have a particularly negative experience? When you moved, when you moved from California to Minnesota, did they tell you about the weather we have here before you made that decision?
Well, unfortunately, I married a Minnesota girl.
That happens to a lot of people. Yeah. So here you are. When you were new, let's say a hypothetical situation, you're in downtown Minneapolis and you're not, sure which way to go to get to the IDS center, right?
Right.
And you're walking down the street and you're looking for directions, and you see a police officer, and he tells you the IDS center is over here, and you see a bystander, and they say actually it's in the opposite direction. Which way do you think you'd walk?
I would take both into consideration, I guess.
I probably
wouldn't
right?
ask two people. I guess to answer your question, I wouldn't ask two people. I would have no problem asking a bystander if that's the first person there. I don't think it's the job of a police officer to navigate people, so I probably would have just asked the bystander.
But if the police officer told you, no, go that way, and the bystander said, no, it's over there, do you believe that you would evaluate, I guess, both of those directions equally?
Well, it depends if I'm alone or with my wife. I would just ask my wife.
Okay. But your wife isn't there, and you're by yourself, and you're looking for direction. Whose direction are you going to follow?
If I have to choose,
Yes.
The police officer, I guess. It's a tough question to answer because, if he's the first one I asked, I would go that way. If I'm halfway down and I don't think it's right, I'd go back the other way.
The point of the question, which I'm sure you surmise, is that you said when questioned by counsel that you would credit the testimony of a police officer the same as any other witness, and you're under oath and you're answering the questions, I'm assuming honestly and as best you can. But I need you to really think about that. Given what you stated are some fairly strongly held beliefs about police officers. It sounds like you believe that police officers don't get as much respect as they deserve. Is that right?
I don't think I used those words.
It was on the survey. The questionnaire.
I think what I'm trying to say is, they made a choice to go into that profession, and I feel that profession has, its ups and downs, and it has its, I'm trying to think of the right word for it, safety issues at some point, and so I respect that. Just like I strongly respect anybody that decides to go into the military. I have respect for that. So I wouldn't say I have a strong belief that police officers are going to be right all the time. I'm more answered that as I respect the police. I respect people who serve the country.
And really that does get to the point of the question. Believe me, I'm not challenging whether or not it's right to have a strong respect for police officers. What I'm asking you to do is, given those beliefs that you have, really evaluate whether you could fairly, evaluate a case. And for example, if a bystander was saying something and a police officer was saying the opposite, to be able to give both of those witnesses the same degree of credibility. And can you assure us, and you be sure that you would be able to do that?
Yes, absolutely.
I wanted to follow up a little bit about the, you did express some concern about serving as a juror in this case because of the high-profile nature. And I think that what you said was that it could possibly put your, put your family in harm or in harm's way. Do you remember saying that?
Yeah.
Can you just tell me what harm do you think, what specifically were you thinking about in terms of harm as a result of publicity?
Well, I would just, when I put that down, I didn't know we would be anonymous. And with, the social media, the information that can be out there quickly, rapidly, and extensively, just didn't want anything coming back to myself or my family. I don't necessarily think it would be like severe violence, just any disruption with the business, with the family, that sort of thing.
So if I'm to understand, you wouldn't fear violence, it was more just with the public nature of things?
You're right, the public perception, I guess, not necessarily the violence.
Yeah. Do you think that you would have more of a concern during the trial or after the trial?
Definitely not during the trial. Potentially after. And again, I wrote that not knowing how this would all play out. It would definitely be after, if at all.
Can you think of a circumstance after a trial in which you think that perhaps the level of danger would be greater?
No, I would look at it as if somebody knew that I was, sat on the jury, if I did sit on the jury, to be more disruptive than anything else. It's like getting a negative review on Amazon, if you will. I know it's a bad example, but that's just what I can think of right now.
That someone might have a negative opinion of you just for having sat on the jury.
Yeah.
And do you think that the opinion, I suppose, would have anything to do with what verdict you might render? So, for example, would you be more concerned if you were to render a not guilty verdict in this case versus a guilty verdict?
No, I don't think that would be relevant at all. I think it would just be the fact that sitting on it, the jury.
You indicated that you did discuss with family members mostly about the riots that took place after George Floyd's death. Is that right?
That's correct.
Can you just give me a little more detail on what you would have discussed with family members and what views were expressed?
Well, for example, just sitting down and seeing, like, have you guys seen what's happening to downtown Minneapolis? Can you believe it? And just the extent of it. And being here and watching this, you don't see that very often. So, just an initial reaction was kind of like the shock, like what's happening. And that was it. We don't, again, we don't spend a lot of time talking about it, or we didn't previously. It was just more of a 30, 42-minute second conversation.
And I'm assuming that the conversation would have taken place over a series of days as things didn't calm down right away.
Yeah.
Did you avoid going into the city of Minneapolis during that time?
Well, during when it was happening?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Did you watch actual live footage of this happening on TV?
I mean, I've seen live footage. I mean, yes, we watch it. We wouldn't, come home and sit and watch it for hours on end. But yes, we could, would definitely seen it and watched it.
From what you were able to see and observe, were you able to determine who or what groups were responsible for the riots and the damage?
No, I mean, I have nothing to base it on. It was, this group or that group. It was just more of it happening, if anything else.
I want to then just turn back. You were asked opinions about the group Black Lives Matter. Council asked you some follow-up questions related to that. And when you were talking about the group and the somewhat unfavorable view you had, you said that you feel the movement has good intentions, but has been involved in too much destruction in our city. And that second part of it has been involved in too much destruction in our city. Can you please explain what you meant by that, specific destruction?
Well, I just think with the rioting or all the burning down of, I don't say burning down, that's the wrong choice of words, but the vandalism of the city, and seeing the letters BLM, whether that organization did it or not, it was kind of hard not to not see those. So not accusing that organization of actually doing it, but it was hard not to see those letters. So that's why it was like somewhat unfavorable if they were involved in it, or if any faction of that group was involved in it. I don't think that's necessarily a positive way to portray what you're trying to come across, or portray your what your philosophy is and what your goal is for that movement.
All right. Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate the answers you've given us today.
Okay. Thank you.
State strikes.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, sir. You are being excused from this jury,
Okay.
and so the deputy will collect some things for you. So this also ends your jury service for this term as well, so you don't have to worry about reporting for anything else.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.